Welcome, everybody. I'm Rajat Bhargava, co-founder and CEO of JumpCloud. Welcome to the Make Work Happen podcast. I've got my friend and co-founder, Greg Keller, here with us, and I've got two amazing guests, industry luminaries. We've got Rak Garg and Francis Odum. So welcome, guys. Thanks for joining us. Rak, will you please introduce yourself, and then we'll have Francis introduce himself.
Yeah, certainly. And by the way, Francis is much more of a luminary than I am, but thank you guys for having me. My name is Rak. I'm a partner at Bain Capital Ventures. We're a $10 billion firm in Silicon Valley. I spend a lot of time in cybersecurity and IT, and that at the intersection of AI, basically. I am an early stage partner. I've been here for about 4 years. And before this, I used to run identity at Atlassian. And so I worked on single sign-on, SCIM user provisioning, administration, governance, DLP, all of the things that I'm sure we'll talk about. And during my time there, I just felt sort of, I was pulling my hair out at why is identity such a problem for every organization. And so as an investor, that's where I've spent a lot of my time.
Awesome. Thanks, Rak. Francis.
Thank you all for having me. Pleasure to be with all of you. My name is Francis Odum, founder of the Software Analyst Cyber Research. Pretty much an analyst firm. We work with a lot of new and emerging companies across four major areas: data security, security operations, obviously cloud security, and then identity security, which we're going to be talking about. Have an audience of over about 70,000 people who read and engage with our work. And our goal is really just to share the best research and insights on what we hear from practitioners and what we hear from the ecosystem around identity. So excited to have this conversation with all of you, and ready to dive in.
That's awesome. Thanks both. Appreciate it. We've been talking about this conversation for a while, so excited to be here. Excited to do it. Go ahead, Greg. Do you want to jump in for a second?
No, we've been threatening this for some time. Just a collection of minds that we needed an excuse to get together. So I'm glad we could do this.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's dive in, and we're going to talk about identity management, just the whole sector space, and I want to start with let's go back in time. Let's go back in history. How did this whole category start? How did it evolve? What was sort of the initial driver? And I'm going to throw a little spiciness in this, but do you think now, as it sort of evolved, identity management might be the most important security category? So, tell us a little bit about how it's evolved, and maybe Francis, if you want to start, and then Rak jump in, and Greg will jump in too.
When we think about historically of identity, even people who have been like way older than myself in the early 90s or thereabout, it wasn't even called identity security. I think a lot of people actually underestimate the fact that we now call this our profession identity, but it really wasn't. It was really just, it was around IT management pretty much. I think a huge part of this industry and what we know. And so you could break down the identity ecosystem into different parts, right? Your auth and your authentication type protocols and the authorization auth protocols. But for the most part, authentication was obviously how this whole industry started. And all of these really started out with novel directory services, which many of you might actually be very familiar with in the early days. And quite frankly, enterprises at the time, the internet was just evolving. We had all these new things around workstations, and companies were just like, hey, we need ways to actually help us centralize directories. We need ways to actually help us actually go about how we actually categorize users, groups, roles within, and we needed some type of a centralized system. And I think in the earlier evolution, we have what was called this active directory type ecosystem. And this is what novel directory services really helped us shape in the early days. And then obviously we started to see that evolve much gradually into full what we know as LDAP, and even the word active directory really fully flushed out itself. And then obviously with SaaS applications evolving, we started to see the role of single sign-on and kind of where we're at. But yeah, if I were to summarize it, there's so many ways in which we could actually look at it. But I think the core thing about the history of identity was solving a problem for IT at the time, and it all came down to how do we manage group roles and credentials for all of our users. So maybe there are different things we could unpack there, but maybe I'll leave Rak to build upon that, and we could unpack all of the history a little bit more.
Sure.
Yeah, sounds good. Maybe just to add to that, I agree with everything Francis said. Users, groups, permissions. We also forget that non-human users were always part of the identity stack. So like today we hear a lot about non-human identity as being kind of this growth vector that people are very worried about, AI agents, all this kind of stuff. In the good old days of the early 90s, you had to connect computers and mainframes, printers, network protocols to make sure the right computers could access the right printers. You had these network attached storage drives. All of that lived in the directory. And so you can basically think of, this is way before graph databases, but you can think of this really messy graph, a dictionary of a user as an entity, and then all of the things that they should theoretically have access to. And LDAP, as Francis was saying, emerged as a protocol to manage all of those things. But it was really sort of born out of this centralization that existed at the time, where you had these boxes in the office, and you would deploy, Novell systems or Microsoft systems or whatever onto that box, and everything had to live on that box. So if you didn't have an instance of a directory on that box, no one connecting through that box was going to be able to print anything in the office that week. And so it was just so central to like basic productivity that you had to figure out identity at the time. And then I think it diffused, and we built application experiences around each layer of that stack. And thankfully today Okta doesn't control printers, but there's still a lot of holdover from that model, I think, that we still have to endure and live with today.
It's funny you brought up, Rak, non-human identities. Where my old aging brain goes is DHCP. I mean, it's the original form of applying an identity to something non-human. So yeah, you guys missed, maybe by extension, talking about Novell, but X500, you can trace all of these evolutions from how the major market shifts happened from, mainframe and completely thin client-based computing. X500 Novell shifted into, the whole industry shifted into 3-tier architectures, client server, and thicker clients. Guess what? That's when the world of LDAP and lighter weight directory services came up, LDAP being one. And now here we are with a complete inversion back into, what is thin client computing through a browser in many ways, and just shifting, where the source of authentication comes from, regardless, no matter what phase we have been through, no matter what the protocol is. We are talking about the basic principle of computer science. You need access, and that is 2 steps: authentication between 2 things, the requestor and the person granting the request, and then authorization. What is their set of entitlements? Everything else is just fluff and location and space and, and technology stack. That's all it is.
Yeah, I think there's sort of 2 things for me that are really interesting when I think about history. One is the network is what sort of spawned this, right? I mean, before, like, if, you guys aren't old enough, but Greg and I are. So if you go back to when it was just like you had a PC and you were the only person that could access it, like there was no sense of identity management. You didn't really need it. You just logged into your machine and, it wasn't sort of centrally controlled. Obviously the network changed that. And then I think the second thing is, you have to give a lot of credit to Microsoft in terms of their vision of what they wanted to do with Active Directory. They really wanted you to log in once and be able to access whatever it is you needed, wherever it was on the network and in the domain, if you will, right? Which is a pretty interesting concept that, we don't think really should exist anymore. But like there was a real innovation there of having somebody log in, get access to whatever they need without having to continue to log in and, re-authenticate and all that, but still make it super secure. And I think those are 2 really interesting parts of history that, kind of when you roll it forward, now we have sort of this massive explosion and dispersion of IT resources wherever they might be. And we're all searching for that same experience that maybe 20, 25 years ago, Microsoft was trying to create.
Yeah, and just one thing I'll just build upon, even just to aggregate everyone's point of view, really, is the fact that Oh, historically, we never thought of it identity as being a security problem. Like actually, like when you actually read about the history of identity, it was just more like we just needed some type of a system, some type of mechanisms to manage users and passwords. Like no one was, I think, in the early 2000s, like you probably could verify this as well. No one was really worried about the security risk as much as it started to evolve as like, oh boy, bad guys could actually do something with passwords and username. But early on, it was all around centralizing IT management. You know, how do we actually just manage usernames and passwords, and like how do we store this? How do we have a direction to organize this information? And gradually, you started to have that evolution of it, risk, and then now it really is identity is really a security and like problem, and like it's now really flushed in. I mean, we always wanted to solve security from the get go, but I think that prominence of security really coming to the conversation has increased, and you're seeing this even change in the organization where CIOs and CTOs who are responsible for just identity type stores are now talking with CISOs, or that unit is actually coming more. But I feel like that evolution is something that had to take some time, even though we were always solving for security problems from the get-go, you could argue, but I think it's just that perception. So anyways, I'm sure we'll talk about that, but that was
No,
just
I was
something
gonna go there, Francis, because like I think maybe when do you think that shift happened, Rak? If you sort of think about like it really was just sort of a function, right? It wasn't sort of like a big deal. And by the way, it was Active Directory, so everybody had the same thing. Like when do you think that sort of mental shift has happened, or do you think it's still in the process of happening and people aren't there yet?
It's a really hard thing to pinpoint because, in the 60s, you would see Multics and the time sharing systems get hijacked by people who wanted more time on the computing system at MIT, right? And so I think people were aware of this idea of pretending to be someone that you're not to gain access to a system, undue access to a system. That was something that was, I think, in the collective consciousness, and people knew about that. I think the budget owner and who cared more about that problem is what has changed over time. So historically, the budget owner for that problem was IT because IT dealt with it. IT was the one in the front line managing, who had access to which things, approving the requests, denying the requests, et cetera. And then I think in the early 2000s, you start to see real breaches. I mean, you start to see
Right.
mass scale attacks that actually involved social engineering of employees, getting access to their password, using that password to move laterally in the organization. And that made it a security person's problem because the initial step, and you can talk to anybody in the endpoint world, anyone in the network world, anyone in the email world, the initial step to getting into an organization is to find a chink in the armor when it comes to identity. I mean, that's how you get into a network, and then you move laterally. Then you do all the other stuff that the detection and the response people care about. So it's been this process problem that IT has had to endure for a long time. It's had consequences that security bears the cost of, and it's got all of these sort of ergonomic challenges that everybody else in a company cares about, right? Like it's a very natural thing to not want to log in a million times in your workday to different systems. It's a very natural thing to have the same password for everything. And so how do you deal with that is sort of this problem that no product has really been able to address, which is why it's hard to pinpoint this kind of switch from IT to security. But I just think it's who bears the consequences and who's paying to deal with those consequences is what's evolved over time.
Yeah, I think identity is super interesting category, right? Because like you said, it's sort of the core of productivity and it's how things get done. And yet it's also this, massive, risk vector that people have to be concerned about. So yeah.
And about this, it's we're coming back around again, so to speak. I mean, Francis, you kicked this off, and you're correct that identity was and largely still remains a quote IT problem, or at least a chore. And you can watch the whack-a-mole way the industry started to solve for security problems, which was, oh God, this is about the firewall. Protect us within the confines of our domain, which happen to be inside the brick and mortar presence. Then it became about mobility, meaning a actual laptop, and the ability for it to connect outside of a firewall infrastructure. The whole world of device-borne antivirus, was created. Now EDR being a modern variant of that. Now full circle, it's all about access. it's from any machine to anything, and it's really all about the data. Just the we have now amassed. We don't lack for ingestion of data, and now you see the CrowdStrikes of the world as these $80+ billion market cap companies capitalizing on signals. That's what we've become.
So let's hold that thought for just a second, because I want to come back to that. But let's sort of dive into, just for a second, let's bridge the gap from history to kind of present day a little bit, right? Which is, look, we had this thing come out, Active Directory came out in 1999. It's been absolutely the most dominant identity product in the world for, probably 2+ decades. From your perspective, Rak, how did it become so dominant? Why is it so dominant? And what do you think it means for the space and for our industry that, it's so dominant? And then Francis, please jump in, and we'll have Greg jump in too.
I think the reasons for why it achieved dominance, in my opinion, are sort of clear cut. There's two things. One is, it is the Microsoft way to win on bundling, right? And so Azure AD, and at the time it wasn't AD, it wasn't Azure AD, it was just AD. But it would be literally given away for free as part of Microsoft's enterprise plans. And obviously in that day, you didn't have kind of the E1, E3, E5 structure that you have today. But basically, if you bought something that would run on Windows Server, or you bought a Windows Server stack, you would come with Active Directory, and you'd be encouraged to use it, because that was one of the rare ways that you could actually use LDAP to standardize all of your identity processes. So bundling created value in that era. And I think if you meet people who are total Microsoft shops, they would argue it still creates value. I mean, it's still much, much cheaper than doing a best of breed kind of identity stack. I think the second reason is that they very rightfully identified that you could decouple identity and the directory and all of these things from the business applications that they had to govern, right? And so AD was its own thing. It didn't ship as part of the operating system. You could use it on really any sort of footprint or network map that you wanted to, as long as you were a Microsoft shop. And then they were one of the early ones to expand out of Microsoft and include other things that would want to connect into the directory. And so I think those two reasons really cemented Microsoft's lead in identity in the early days, when the competition was Novell and other companies. Mm-hmm. I think today they've done a very good job of building a suite, right? The Entra suite, which is what Active Directory and that suite of products is called now, includes every sub-vertical and subsector of identity. So they have a PAM product for privileged access management. They have an IGA product for access request workflows. They have a customer identity product to go compete with Auth0 and Okta. They've got verified credentials, so you can do passkeys in any app, right, as long as you have Active Directory. So they've just done a very, very good job of executing on every possible way that you would want to authenticate or that you would want to authorize a user for a system. And I think that's why we're in this world of Microsoft lock-in. I think a lot of CISOs and IT people know about the lock-in. I think they're looking for ways to break the lock-in, because identity is such an important risk vector. You typically don't want everything to live inside of one vendor's kind of wheelhouse. And obviously that's been great for you guys and for a bunch of other companies in the identity world. But that's sort of where that's kind of how I see Microsoft having developed its lead.
Yeah, I mean, bang on, like pretty much just spot on. I mean, enterprises, especially IT teams, just care about ease of use and simplifying complexity. And that's really what Microsoft did, And I think when you also think about the fact that ADU eventually got integrated with Windows Server 2000, and this was the most popular, this is we're looking at the early 2000s, right? It was extremely easy for IT teams to just embed it into what they had already. And I think subsequently too, Microsoft to themselves, I think also connecting it together with Windows Server 2000, but also making the whole authentication process easy and connecting it to some of their existing suite. And Microsoft was also a dominant player. I mean, everyone loved Windows Server 2000 at the time, and then just being able to integrate those has been just absolutely just brilliant of them. And then I think over time, from the late 2000s and 2010, with the evolution of SaaS apps, what they've done really well subsequently is further building this ecosystem around SharePoint, Office 365, and then putting all of that around Azure AD, and then even just their group policy objects too. I think the way they've done groupings too has also made that extremely easy for managing thousands of users. And so it all comes down to what Rock ease of use, complexity, bundling, and around the ecosystem has been a big, huge. But I do think we as an industry need to talk about, is this good? Like, is this fit? Like all everything is just interconnected within this one ecosystem. What are the alternatives? Yes, is this just good for the industry? I think it's just an open question, and we don't know quite the answer. I think that's why we're exploring, and everyone just wants to have an open conversation. Is this good or bad for the industry, and what could be the gaps that enterprises are facing as a result of this? Even though we know it makes it easy, it's cheaper, less complexity, but what are the pros and cons? So yeah, and that's what time will tell. So
I've got two follow-ups to that. One is to your point of, is it good for the industry or not good for the industry? I mean, one of the things obviously that's happened is there have been a number of breaches at Microsoft and a number of security incidents and outages, both of those things. How do you think about those with respect to, how customers interpret those and, how the industry thinks about that? And then I'll give the follow on in just a second, but Rak, if you want to start there.
Yeah, I mean, look, man, when the vendors who are supposed to keep you safe get hacked, it's not great for customer confidence. And I think we've seen examples of that time and time again from security companies. When McAfee got hacked in the early 2000s, that was kind of the beginning of the end for McAfee. When CrowdStrike went down, it wasn't a security incident to my understanding, but when CrowdStrike went down, you saw a tremendous lack of customer confidence in CrowdStrike amongst the top enterprises. I mean, the American airline industry basically shut down for a couple of weeks. Um, in Okta's case, we've seen the same thing. Okta had a litany of horrific breaches from 2022 onwards, and we can sort of see what's been going on at the company from the outside as kind of a response to that. So I think customer confidence gets shaken for sure. The question is, what do you do about it? So in a lot of these point products case, it's fine. I can go deploy. If I already have a best of breed stack, I can go deploy a different IGA. I can rip out some IGA that I have. Or in kind of like an email security vendor's case, I can line up Tessian and Proofpoint and Abnormal, and I can sort of, look at how they perform relative to each other. You can't really do that in the endpoint. I mean, deploying all these endpoint agents, if you wanted to get rid of CrowdStrike, is very hard. I'd argue it's even harder to get rid of the directory. I mean, directory migrations can take years. There are some companies that started their on-prem to cloud directory migration before kind of 2015 that are still working on it today. And it's not because they're doing a bad job or anything. It's because the business evolves. You acquire a new company, they have a different IDP. What do? Your company gets bought out by private equity. Maybe they want to bring in a different identity stack. What do? And so there isn't really a good way to do migrations at scale. Maybe that changes with AI because it is a ton of manual work. But at least up until now, there hasn't been an answer outside of really just a ton of steel will and a lot of effort to go and do something about your directory system not being the right one for you anymore.
yeah, I really want to double click on something you mentioned there. It is so true. The cost of migration is such a problem because as much as we could talk about all the breaches Microsoft and they should be kept accountable. I think as an industry we should always keep them accountable to they just can't allow these things to happen. The problem is just that migration. When a lot of your IT infrastructure and architecture is just deeply embedded into Windows, it makes it extremely hard to displace. And companies are just like, well, we know about all these bad things happening, but we can't migrate. It's too costly. It's going to disrupt things, especially when you have hybrid use cases. I think that's where I think the future will change with cloud native environment. I think you could see easier displacements, but companies that have this on-prem versus cloud are complex. But Greg, I don't know, you wanted to build on something there.
No, you guys are spot on. And what depresses me are the conversations that I'm in, hundreds a month. It feels like when you're talking with companies that are so they're just blocked by a pathway forward from a long legacy of various products that keep them kind of trapped. And you hear them talk about, well, we understand the risks. We put it in our risk register and we load up on cyber insurance. And that's just not good enough in my head and my heart. I mean, what does that really do for the customer, right? That mitigates some legal complexity for the vendor who has these tools to quote protect themselves, which by extension should be protecting the customer. And that just saddens me for the industry. And yet we're talking about these breaches and exploits. All of us are trying to develop a significant amount of credibility of managing access from space, from the cloud. And, we are not alone. The Oktas of the world, are all fighting this inertia of people still like Rak. This is, part of the mitigation of like people not going all cloud is because they still have reservations and hesitations to let the final, aspects of maybe some core infra that is servicing some core app away, out of their cold, still alive hands. It mystifies me.
Francis, you said, is this good or bad for the industry? And I wonder if, you sort of made a point of saying, at some point, hopefully it'll make it easier over time. I think the portability at some point, that's definitely good for customers, right? Maybe not as good for the vendors, right? But it's going to be better for the customers. And I think ultimately, it's not just portability of identity. Remember, like there's a lot of lock-in with the data center infrastructure, IaaS solutions. You've got AWS, GCP, Azure, like all of those things are massive lock-ins, right? And at some point, I think customers will continue to demand that there has to be portability of these things. And the vendors maybe who do provide more portability might get some more acceleration in their success, right? Because they allow customer that optionality. You said one thing that was interesting too, Rak, which is, basically Microsoft's created this holistic system, right? I mean, they have every category covered in identity management. So I wanted to sort of just ask point blank, like if they've got it all covered, why are we all bothering, right? Like you've got a lot of companies, JumpCloud's included in that. You've got Okta, you've got a few others. Why bother if Microsoft has this covered and they have so much dominance with E3 and E5? What are we all doing?
Yeah, I think you should go talk to a bunch of Microsoft admins. I mean, in my conversations, it feels like Microsoft does have the product stack covered, but it is extremely hard to put that product stack into production and then maintain it over a long period of time across all the things that change inside of your company. Because you have to remember, when things happen inside of a modern company, nobody's asking IT first, right? No one's saying, "Hey, IT, can I pull down a container for S3?" That's not happening. You just do it. And then the same day, at the end of the day, you might spin down the container because your build job is done or something. No one's asking IT when they're like, "Hey, can I bring in Notion?" No, they're like, "I'm going to bring in Notion." If they can't do it with their work email, they'll just do it on their personal email. They'll put work data in it anyway. So IT has been taken out of the equation when it comes to businesses changing and adapting. And a lot of the Microsoft stack, I think, was built for a time when that was not the case. It was built for a time when IT had a lot more power, a lot more centralized resourcing. And when you look at what it takes to maintain AD, you see a lot of that. You see a lot of manual policy writing. You see a lot of, frankly, a lot of granular control that would be a good thing in ordinary cases, but it's unmanageable. I mean, the average company's got about 8,000 groups. So you might have, a couple thousand employees that are in different permutations of 8,000 groups. How do you maintain all of that? I mean, there's no human brain that can hold all of that, even amongst the most skilled IT admins. So yes, Microsoft has done a tremendous job. I think they have around 700 million monthly active identities that log in to Azure AD each month. If that was a social network, that would be one of the biggest in the world. But the people who are owning that system, who are having to change, their business is changing and now they have to change that system to account for that business change. I think those people are really hunting for something that makes life easier. And that's where we see a lot of the companies in identity that really take off, like JumpCloud. A lot of those companies make that burden easier. They take the burden off of the IT person in maintaining that stack and system. So I think that's the opportunity. I don't think the opportunity is to go build a better SSO.
Francis, thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I really love those thought rock. And then just to also add to that, so I also think we're also we also have to remember all of this that most companies are Windows based, but we also have companies that are built around Linux and like have Mac OS types or just a large amount of SaaS applications that are just not Windows based. And how do we interconnect those? And I do think the future solutions like JumpCloud and a number of other vendors out there who are agnostic to a specific OS system have an opportunity to make that interconnect and like helping to bring in this Windows, Mac OS, Linux type environment. And I think there's a big market. There is a big opportunity for that, as well as also integrating with multi-cloud, because we also know there's an opportunity there in terms of like being able to help those customers with hybrid type environment. And that's quite frankly where I see the alternatives or the opportunities there on the market. Because yes, because for my conversation, yeah, Windows is very dominant, but hey, there are quite a number of organizations that run on Linux or have most times it's always some combination of them. And I think some of the CISOs I've spoken to are looking for some combination, need solutions that could be this identity type fabric, if you want to call it, that's able to help interconnect, whether it's multi-cloud environments or infrastructure stack. And I do think we don't talk about this too, but and I know this is very future oriented, but if we gradually move to this passwordless, and this has been going up in a lot more conversations, as much as people think it's like out there, but like FIDO2 passkeys and like I think the more we move into this world of decentralized identities, the less of a reason why we would need to rely on this traditional Microsoft type stack. And I think future-oriented solutions need to start thinking about this world. And then if this AI world, like we're thinking about the next thing and what does this could look like, for non-humans and identities, like what could that actually look like? But passwordless, some type of universal identity fabric for multi-cloud or multi-environments like macOS and Windows. I do think there is an opportunity for the beyond just the Microsoft shop, because I think Microsoft will always have a presence, no matter how much we think.
But is there an opportunity to topple Microsoft from the top? I mean, is there, Rak, if you said this is a startup that I'd want to go build, or I'd love to see somebody build that, is there somebody that could topple that? And is there a different vector or that they could come in that would just completely change the game?
Yeah, I think toppling Microsoft is probably the wrong framing. I think it's probably more positive sum than that, in the sense that even for a Microsoft shop, I would be willing to bet there are a number of kind of management challenges, process challenges, like Francis was saying, data fabric and interconnectivity challenges. I think the opportunity is to let Microsoft be the system of record, and then build the system of intelligence and management on top of that, right? Frankly, if you own the directory, people come to you first for identity, and that's why I think we saw Okta having kind of the tailwind that it did in the mid 2010s. That's why Microsoft's had this long tailwind. If you don't own the directory, then I think you can own everything around the directory. So you can, I think today's day and age, I would probably look for an AI-based company that can go and autonomously figure out what is the right level of access for the right level of person, based on the HR data we have, based on their context from the organization, based on the files that they touch and interact with in something like Glean. And you can do this whether it's a Microsoft shop or not, right? Right-sizing permissions is a big problem that nobody is doing well. I think today a lot of people are worried about the agent authentication problem, right? So like if we thought about this inductively in a tightly constrained use case where you have one AI agent that's talking to one sort of system, one system of record, OAuth solves that problem. Like we know how to do that. Token scopes solve that problem. Yep. Now you have 80 applications that are each spinning up and spinning down millions of agents to do tiny things that all interact with maybe hundreds of different systems. OAuth doesn't necessarily scale to that level of access, right? I mean, there's no way you could sort of with low latency and with enough efficiency go and rotate all of those tokens to meet a policy, for example. So that's a problem that has to get solved. And we see a lot of companies that are doing work in that area. And I think the last thing is, a lot of the Microsoft suite was built for a time when identity was not the perimeter. You still had these firewalls and IPS systems. You still had maybe, in the mid 2010s, maybe a SASE or a ZTNA kind of system. I think today the network has sort of not become the perimeter, and identity has become the perimeter.
Right.
And so what that means for end users and for the people managing them is, how do you deal with device reconciliation? How do you know if the person who's holding a phone is the person who should be holding the phone? And Francis alluded to passkeys as being a good way to kind of solve that problem. So I just think we see a lot more dissemination today of identity that we used to see, and I think that's what creates a lot of these new opportunities.
I think there's like this sort of interesting existential thing that we're seeing too, which is we have, as you guys I think know, I mean, we have tens of thousands of customers around the globe, and the characteristic of the person operating JumpCloud in most ways, not always, but most ways, does not look, smell, or taste like a traditional Microsoft MCSE admin. In fact, many of them have never even, built out a Windows server and turned on the AD role. They really don't. They've come from pure cloud. These are kids, 20 years old, 25 years old, and they didn't have these opportunities. They came from Amazon roots, a lot of Google Workspace, and you're watching a different class of admin be born who are much, much more rooted in security practices than they are in building Windows machines, and it's just different, So I agree, Rak, with sort of the assertion of, an intelligence layer that understands entitlements and can mitigate that. I don't agree with the assertion that, Microsoft can perpetually be deferred to as the source. There's just too much variance, whether it's Google or us, or, in cases where Okta doesn't have AD, Okta, I think, that ship has sailed, where there's plenty of example of, just no Microsoft at all in businesses. We see it.
Totally. I completely agree. I mean, I think the multi-IDP problem, or not problem, but just phenomenon,
right.
is a very, very real one, right? And now increasingly, you don't see companies start on Microsoft at all. I mean, you can get it for free today if you're a small company. And instead, we just see a lot of products start with login with Google. I mean, Google Cloud Identity has become a very powerful IDP, even though that's not what they sell it as. And so you do need, I think, something that helps all of these different directories talk to each other and kind of act as one master system.
Okay. And one tiny
ahead,
thing
Francis.
to just build upon is, just to summarize it, I mean, when you deep it goes, Okta size for just the SOAR role, I actually still think Okta still has, like, in the IDP world, right? Like, I think about how big they are, but like how much more an opportunity. So long story short, I do think there's a much bigger opportunity for companies like JumpCloud, obviously, Google, and all of the other alternatives that is just significantly bigger as people phase off Microsoft. Because I don't think this will continue forever. I think we're going through a phase off of this traditional AD way of thinking, but it's a gradual phase. It's not going to happen overnight, and a lot of these alternatives are out there on the market today.
That's awesome. Okay, last thing for us. We're coming up on time, but maybe if we gave people a history, we gave people sort of context. I think we gave people a lot of understanding on what's going on in the space. Maybe last word here is talk to enterprises and organizations out there. What's the one or two pieces of advice that you would give them? Francis, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing I'll probably just say is start thinking about maybe two things. One is start to think about new ways of authentication and biometrics, and whether those are FIDO2s, passkeys, passwords like this. I do think this is going to have to evolve at some level, and companies and organizations should start exploring all of these different alternatives. What that specifically definitive model looks like, every organization is different, and they kind of have to pick. And then I do think the second piece is, as we gradually evolve to this agentic framework within enterprises, where agents now have increasing levels of access and control within the enterprise, think very actively of what your infrastructure stack looks like there. And that's maybe more so pointers as opposed to recommendations of things to think about.
Yeah, no, those are great. Rak?
Yeah, I think in my opinion, a lot of security teams I meet tend to think about the world in terms of compensating controls and overlapping levels of security, right? And so maybe you have identity as the first line, and then you've got an MDM as the second line, and maybe there's something on the endpoint as a third line, and and so on. But I think the issue with that model is that we don't often prioritize coverage because we're sort of like, something downstream will catch it if the first thing doesn't catch it. And so one of the pieces of advice that we have for every CISO we meet on our CISO advisory board is to think long and hard about coverage. Do you feel like you have all of the entities logging into your systems, whether they're humans or not? Do you feel like you have them covered? Do you think they're cataloged? Do you think there is some way to automatically keep that up to date? And I'm not suggesting that people go buy vendors, although there are many that solve that problem. I meet security teams that put 1 or 2 engineers on this, and they figure out ways to kind of build protocols and systems internally to figure this out. Either or is fine, but I think coverage is a big issue. And then I think the second thing is, I think IT is very reactive. It's very sort of like, oh, you need access to Figma, I'll give you access to Figma, and then let me know when you don't need it anymore. And that model has just led to licensing run amok. It's led to completely oversized permissions. I think insider risk is ballooning because it really just takes one person with access to the Slack to click on the wrong link in an email or pick up, respond to the wrong text on their phone. And now the entire Slack instance is compromised. And we saw that at Uber. We saw that at a bunch of places. So as much as we want to trust our employees to do the right thing, the more employees we have, the more risk non-linearly increases. And so we need to figure out ways to safeguard against that risk. And I don't have a good solution there yet, but I think there's a variety of different approaches that I've seen, ranging from right-sizing permissions to kind of the zero trust model, just lock everything down and then have these ephemeral permissions that you rotate every now and then, all the way over to sort of like, I even see people doing more in sort of microsegmentation at this point, of both logical microsegmentation, but then also kind of physically of the network and of your cloud network. So a bunch of different solutions, but I think coverage and then I think ongoing maintenance are 2 big problems that I see in identity teams.
Yeah, and I think the scary part about the last thing you talked about is the bad guys are trying to get hired inside of organizations, right? So we know that that's happening, right? So if they're already being hired on the inside, they kind of have an easier path to go and get the things that they want. So yeah, pretty scary stuff.
Yeah, I mean, just I think it was about a month ago that Mandiant found that KnowBe4 had unknowingly hired a couple of DPRK people, which is wild because KnowBe4 is the company you trust to tell your employees what to do, right? And so it's
right. Yeah, scary stuff. Yeah, Greg, what's your last 2 pieces of advice?
Yeah, first, I'm going to respond to Ray. I think what you said was on point. We have to solve for this employee problem, but the solution isn't, more friction in the pathway of the end user. People like, Francis, you're spot on about the form factor of a YubiKey or similar. These are still, believe it or not, too much friction. Trying to shove a 6-digit OTP code into something. Oh, I got to get my thing out and, my phone and all this. There are better pathways. So we need to solve for, the friction aspect and the burnout that employees do, so much so that they will outright try and side skirt things and find ways. Rak, to your point, screw it. I'm just going to use my Gmail account. Like, I'm tired of this. Like, I'll port data over so I can do it in a more flexible area. The other thing is more abstract, which is, what I've witnessed is a dearth in, and this is not a gross generalization, it's just a historic generalization, which is a dearth in really creative IT thinking. It's super formulaic. It's based on a pattern of type of worker that really grabs on hard to the certifications and they're as precious gems. And if they can perform the function, listen, IT is a thankless job. If they can perform the function and there's no pain brought on to them, no employees or bosses with screaming pitchforks, then it's a great day, right? And unfortunately, that is a propagated sort of like lifestyle inside of IT. And these are the things that people often forget. And the vendors cater to that. And, it's this vicious life cycle that never lets the sort of world of IT evolve. What I'm seeing in the cases that are the opposite of that is a convergence of IT and SecOps thinking, vendors who cater and they really understand access is a security problem, not a historic IT problem, right? And the most thing that warms my heart are proactive IT folks trying to learn the space, really get more proactive with their security partners and how they are part of the apparatus, not the reactive, end result, of a security incident. So like that's my second piece, which is if anyone is listening, especially IT folks, start to really think about how you want to evolve. That is at the center of what will propel us forward versus keeping us in this mired sort of, propagation of same security vulnerabilities we're still dealing with.
So I'll jump in, Greg. Last thing, all for joining. This is great. Two things, maybe. One is really quick. I think treating identity as security, right? So like, I don't think that's universal. I wish it was, but I think making sure people think about that identity is really absolutely about security. And second thing is the end user experience. Greg, you sort of touched on it. Making sure that we have a great, easy end user experience for people, because the easier we can make it, the better. I think the better security we're going to get, right? Ultimately. So anyway, thank you, Francis. Thank you, Rak. It's been awesome. Thank you for taking the time. I hope folks get a lot of value out of the conversation. It's always fun to kind of understand the history of how we got here. And I think hopefully that helps people think about, kind of where do we go from here? There's definitely a lot going on in the space. Super exciting. But thank you both for taking the time to spend it with us today.
Always fun to see you guys. Thanks for having us on.
Yes.
Thanks,
thank you.
guys.
And just thank you for raising education on this topic too. Pleasure speaking with all of you. So thank you.
Thanks, gents.
All right. Cheers, guys.